A good man is just a bad man who ran out of second chances. But what if a town's only chance is a man who ran out of good? Some men build their own prisons. Others are born into them, and the lucky ones, or maybe the unlucky ones, find a way to escape. Caleb lived in a prison of his own making, its walls built from stolen gold and a lifetime of regret. He was a ghost in the town of Redemption, a name given by men who believed in second chances, a name that felt like a mockery to him. 7 years ago, he'd been known as the Rattlesnake, a name whispered with a mix of fear and admiration from Texas to the Dakota Territories. He and his gang, the Sons of Thunder, were a blur of dust and gunfire, striking fast and leaving nothing but empty safes and grieving widows in their wake. They were ghosts then, too, until the last job. A bank in a small town, much like Redemption. A shot fired in haste. A young teller, barely a man, bleeding out on the floorboards as Caleb stood over him, the roar of the gun still ringing in his ears. It wasn't a planned part of the job. It was a mistake. A moment of panic. But it was a mistake he carried with him like a brand. It was a mistake that cost him everything. He'd buried his share of the loot, bought a small plot of land on the edge of town, and spent the last 7 years tilling the unforgiving soil, trying to bury the past with every furrow he plowed. He was no longer the Rattlesnake. He was just Caleb, a quiet farmer with a haunted look in his eyes, and a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, a memento from that last job. He lived alone, his only company, the ghosts of his past, and a worn-out photograph of a woman with a kind smile, and a young boy with his same piercing eyes. His wife and son, both lost to a fever that swept through a small settlement years before he became the Rattlesnake. He held on to the picture, the edges soft and frayed from years of handling. It was his penance, a constant reminder of what he had to lose, of what he had already lost. The town of Redemption had taken him in, mostly out of pity. No one knew his past. They saw a man broken by grief, a man who worked until his hands were raw and his back ached, a man who kept to himself. The local sheriff, a stoic man named Elias, gave him a wide berth. Elias had a weary look in his eyes that spoke of a life lived on the fringes of chaos. He was a man who understood a certain kind of quiet desperation. He would nod to Caleb on the rare occasions they passed on the dusty Main Street, a silent acknowledgement that both men were carrying burdens the other would never fully understand. Caleb's days were a monotonous cycle of labor and solitude. He would wake before the sun, the air crisp and cold, and work until his muscles screamed for rest. He had a few chickens, a scrawny cow, and a small vegetable patch. It was a simple life, a stark contrast to the violence and chaos that had defined his past. He found a measure of peace in it, a temporary reprieve from the gnawing guilt that lived in the hollow of his stomach. But peace was a fleeting thing, and redemption was about to be put to the test. The dust storm came first, a harbinger of the evil that would follow. It was a thick, suffocating cloud that blotted out the sun, turning day into a sickly twilight. It was in the middle of this storm that they arrived. A gang calling themselves the Reapers, led by a man named Silas. Silas was a different kind of monster than Caleb had been. Caleb had been driven by a desperate need for money, for a better life he could never quite seem to grasp. Silas was driven by pure malice. His eyes held a cold, vacant look, like a man who had seen the bottom of humanity and decided to live there. They rode into town, a dozen of them, their horses, hooves muffled by the thick dust. The townsfolk, already cowering from the storm, locked their doors and held their breath. The Reapers were known for their brutality, for taking what they wanted and leaving a trail of death in their wake. They were the kind of men who broke things just to see them shatter. The first thing they did was take over the saloon, a subtle form of public domination. They drank the whiskey and laughed, their voices a jarring contrast to the tense silence of the town. The second thing was to break the bank's doors. It was a theatrical gesture, a display of dominance. They weren't after the money, they were after the town's spirit. The townsfolk, accustomed to the slow rhythm of life in Redemption, were frozen in fear. Sheriff Elias, a man of quiet authority, not brute force, stood on the street, his hand on his holster, a silent challenge in his eyes. Silas stepped out of the saloon, a smirk on his face, and walked slowly toward the sheriff. He was a tall man, lean and coiled with a dangerous energy. He stopped a few feet from Elias, the dust swirling around them. "Sheriff," Silas said, his voice a low hiss, "we'll be here a while. You get in our way, and this town will be renamed Tombstone. Do you understand?" Elias said nothing. He simply looked at Silas, his eyes holding a tired resolve. He was a good man, a decent man, but he was outnumbered and outmatched. He knew he couldn't fight them, not alone. He couldn't protect his town. Not without a miracle. The Reapers began their reign of terror. They broke windows, vandalized shops, and took whatever they pleased from the general store. They were a slow-moving plague, and the town was helpless to stop them. Their laughter echoed through the quiet streets, a constant reminder of their control. The townsfolk lived in a state of perpetual fear, their hopes and dreams replaced by a desperate need for survival. The bank wasn't their first target, it was their second. The first was the town's spirit. They sawed through the door to the bank, not with any sense of urgency, but with a maddening, deliberate rhythm. Caleb, watching from the shadows, felt the familiar pull of a past he had tried so hard to bury. He saw the terror on the faces of the townspeople, the same terror he had once inflicted. He saw a young boy clinging to his mother's skirt, his eyes wide with fear, and a sharp, painful memory pierced through him. The young teller. The boy with the terror in his eyes. The gun. The moment of panic. The sound of a life ending. He walked into the saloon, the air thick with the smell of cheap whiskey and unwashed bodies. Silas looked at him, his eyes narrowing. "You're a ghost, aren't you?" Silas said, a cruel smile on his face. "I've heard stories about you, Rattlesnake. You were good. Not good enough, though. You disappeared." Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. He hadn't spoken to anyone about his past. Not a word. How did Silas know? It didn't matter. What mattered was the look in his eyes. Silas wasn't a bank robber. He was a killer, and he was there for a purpose, not a purse. "You've got a choice, Rattlesnake," Silas continued, leaning in conspiratorially. "You can join us. We could use a man like you. Or you can sit on your farm and watch your town burn." Caleb shook his head. "I'm not that man anymore." Silas laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Once a wolf, always a wolf. You can't wash the blood off your hands." The words struck Caleb with the force of a physical blow. He walked out of the saloon, the taunts of the Reapers following him. He felt the familiar weight of his past settle on his shoulders. He was a ghost in redemption, but Silas had just made him a flesh-and-blood man with a past he could no longer hide. The town's only hope was a man who had once been its biggest threat, a man who had built his own prison, and now he had to tear it down. Caleb stood in the middle of his small plot of land, the soil still clinging to his boots. He looked at the worn photograph in his hand, the faces of his wife and son smiling up at him. They were his reason for living, and they were his reason for dying. He had promised them a better life, a life free from the ghosts of his past. And now, he had to break that promise. He had to go back to being the man he had tried so hard to forget. He walked to the barn and unlatched the heavy wooden doors. The smell of dust and hay filled his nostrils. He walked to a loose floorboard and pried it up, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a leather-bound case. He opened it, his fingers trembling. Inside lay a pair of silver-plated Colt revolvers, his old tools of the trade. They were the same guns he had used on that last job, the same guns that had taken a young man's life. He picked them up, the weight and coldness a familiar sensation. They felt like an extension of his own hand, a part of himself he had tried to excise but could not. He took a deep breath, the dust from the barn filling his lungs. He was the Rattlesnake again. He walked back into town, his boots kicking up dust, his guns holstered at his hips. The townsfolk looked at him, their eyes wide, with a mix of fear and recognition. They saw the man who had been a ghost, and they saw the man he had been before. Sheriff Elias stood in the middle of the street, watching him approach, his own gun still in its holster. "You know what this is, don't you, Elias?" Caleb said, his voice a low rumble. Elias nodded. I do. You're a man with a past. And so am I. We all are. This isn't about the past, Caleb said. This is about the future. This town. These people. They deserve to be safe. Elias held his gaze, a silent question in his eyes. What do you need? Elias asked, his voice barely a whisper. A plan, Caleb said, and a lot of luck. Caleb and Elias laid out their plan in the privacy of the sheriff's office. It was a high-risk, low-reward strategy. They would use the element of surprise to take out the Reapers one by one. It was a gamble. A calculated risk. The townspeople, a mix of farmers, merchants, and saloon girls, listened with a morbid fascination. They were no longer cowards. They were survivors. They had a reason to fight, a reason to live. The confrontation came at high noon. The sun, a fiery orb in a cloudless sky. The heat was a tangible presence. A heavy blanket that settled over the town. The Reapers were gathered in the saloon, their laughter a dissonant sound in the tense silence. Caleb walked out into the middle of the street, the sun glinting off the silver on his guns. Elias stood a few feet behind him, his hand on his holster. Silence! Caleb's voice was a low growl. Come out and face me! Silas emerged from the saloon, a sneer on his face. He was flanked by his men, their eyes filled with a predatory glee. I knew you couldn't stay away, Rattlesnake, Silas said, his voice dripping with malice. You think you can beat us? You're one man. I'm not one man, Caleb said. I'm a town. The townsfolk, armed with rifles and shotguns, emerged from the shadows, their faces grim. They were not a fighting force, but they were a determined one. They had a reason to fight. Silas's eyes widened, a flicker of surprise in their cold depths. The gunfire erupted, a cacophony of sound that shattered the silence. Caleb was a blur of motion, his guns a symphony of controlled violence. He moved with a grace born of a lifetime of practice, his body a well-oiled machine. He was the Rattlesnake again, and he was back with a vengeance. The Reapers fell, one by one, their bodies crumpling in the dust. The townsfolk, guided by Elias's steady hand, fired with a grim determination. They were a community, and they were fighting for their home. Silas, seeing his men fall, lunged at Caleb, a knife glinting in his hand. Caleb dodged the blow, his gun a blur of motion. He had a clear shot, a clean, easy shot, but he hesitated. The young teller's face flashed in his mind, the same face of the boy from before. He saw the flash of the gun, the boy's last breath. He saw his own guilt. He couldn't do it again. He couldn't take another life, not even a man like Silas. He dropped his guns, a clatter of metal on the dusty street. Silas, seeing his opportunity, charged, his knife held high. Caleb waited, his eyes closed, his heart hammering in his chest. A gunshot rang out, not from his gun, but from Elias's. Silas's body hit the ground with a sickening thud. Elias walked up to Caleb, his face grim. He holstered his gun, his eyes holding a mix of respect and sorrow. He understood. The town was safe. The Reapers were gone, but the price had been paid in blood. The townsfolk, once frozen in fear, were now free. They looked at Caleb, a new kind of respect in their eyes. They saw a man who had faced his demons, a man who had chosen to do the right thing, no matter the cost. They no longer saw a ghost, they saw a hero. Caleb picked up his guns, the weight of them feeling heavier than before. He walked back to his farm, the silence a welcome sound after the chaos. He stopped at the edge of his property and looked at the photograph in his hand. He looked at the faces of his wife and son, a small, sad smile on his lips. He had kept his promise. He had done the right thing. He had saved the town, not as the Rattlesnake, but as Caleb, a reformed bank robber who had found his redemption. The town of Redemption had finally earned its name. And he, a man who had lived in a prison of his own making, was finally free. If you enjoyed this incredible tale from the frontier, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories from the American West. Click on the video on the screen for another tale we think you will love.